All right.
Good deal. Well, thank you very
Transcript is
much.
starting. Go ahead. Thanks.
Really appreciate you having me. Nice to follow up with Treb. He's, if you were here last week, he's a friend of mine. We've worked together in the past and hope to do that again in the future. He's a good guy. So, my name is Ginger Grant, and today I'm going to be talking about Power BI with Azure Synapse. Just kind of a bit of a background. I've been talking to a number of clients recently and actually implemented a very large scale implementation. And one of my clients, what they want is they want Power BI reports. And they have a lot of data, and the joining together of the data is something that they feel that's a little bit outside of Power Query. So they want to do that somewhere else. Now, you could still get away with doing it in Power Query and connecting using Synapse environment as well. It just depends on what kind of stuff you have going on. But there's a real big desire to have data that is in a cloud area and then allow you to make a data warehouse and maybe not buy a database because it's Azure. Everything costs money. So just getting into more ways of connecting and using Power BI with large data or with not so very large data. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is different ways that you can incorporate Power BI with Azure Synapse. And since I'm assuming that most people don't know anything about Azure Synapse, I'm talking quite a bit about all things Azure Synapse as well, just to give you an introduction at a high level of how all of it works. All right, a little bit about me. My name is Ginger Grant. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. I am located in the Phoenix, Arizona area, so in the actual desert. I wrote a book on cognitive services, and I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. And I'm currently reviewing Jessica Jolly's book on the certification course. So when that comes out, I think you should all buy it because it's actually a very good book. I finished the review of it. If you want to get a hold of me
I
after,
didn't know you were reviewing that book. Jessica is a very good friend of mine.
ah,
So I'll mention it to her when I see her next week.
yeah, tell her I said hey, because
Will do.
we last talked when she was on the train last week. So, yep, yeah, she's really nice, and I'm like, I don't have time to do a book, and then he said, well, it's for Jessica, and I'm like, well, okay, I can do that one. And actually, it wasn't that big of a deal, so I will be happy to tech review in the future. But it was just kind of fun. Very few comments that weren't positive. She did a very good job. So, all right. And if you want to get a hold of me after this, probably the best place is Twitter because I'm on there way too much at Desert Isle SQL. And I also put my email contact information up should you wish to contact me that way. Okay, so let's get started talking about Synapse Analytics. So what Microsoft has basically used Synapse for is to kind of address a couple of things that they found in the marketplace. Like, for example, take my current client. They have an on-premise database where they've got some other information. Then they have data that they get from the state, and they have to get that via an Excel spreadsheet because that's the only way the state gives it to them. And they also have Salesforce data, and they want to put all this together in one place. And they want the ability to, query it maybe outside of Power BI, but they really want Power BI reports. And so we're going to put all of their data, actually have already, into an Azure Data Lake storage. And think of Azure Data Lake storage as kind of like a giant SharePoint in the sky. So it's got folders, and it can store your data. And with Synapse, you can organize your data. For those of you who are familiar with other things that you may have done in the past, like perhaps SSIS to do configuration, or Azure Data Factory, they kind of rolled that into Azure Synapse. Azure Synapse contains the same code that exists in Azure Data Factory. As a matter of fact, if you go Googling around and you find something like how to do X, how to connect to Salesforce maybe in Data Factory, you'll notice that it says at the top, this will also work in Azure Synapse integration because it's the same code. There's only one thing that it won't do. It will not allow you to lift and shift your code from SSIS to the cloud. You can do that with Azure Data Factory. That's the one part that they didn't include with Azure Synapse. So it's got that data integration layer. The other thing that they added in is they added in a virtual database, which we'll be taking a look at, that you can put on top of that data lake. So why is that useful? Well, my current client is a poor, broke nonprofit, and they want to move their stuff to the cloud because they don't have anybody around anymore to maintain their on-premise stuff. So they want to move stuff to the cloud, but they also want to use their resources to help people rather than pay an Azure bill. So instead of spending money to buy a database, which would cost them roughly minimum $1,200 a month, we are going to create a virtual database on top of this Azure Data Lake storage, these SharePoint in the sky, that you can use in SQL Server Management Studio as well as within Power BI to connect and access all of their data. So, and you can do that with flat files. Now, is it as fast as a database? No. Is it $1,200 a month? No. It's $5 for terabyte of query. So decreases the spend quite a bit. And to make all of this work, it uses a Spark engine. Spark is a layer that was created originally to solve a contest, to be honest with you. So Spark was there back in 2010. I don't know if any of you remember this. Netflix had this contest to see who could come up with a better algorithm for picking movies. And the winner got $1 million and a whole lot of like job opportunities after that. And so a bunch of graduate students from Berkeley got together and figured out how they could load a whole bunch of data into memory, because that would make their analysis a lot faster. And they didn't come anywhere close to winning that contest. But they did come up with a way of loading lots of data into memory and then accessing it very, very quickly. And that is called Spark. A little bit of caveat, they decided, for any of you who have seen Idiocracy, that they liked money. And they went on to develop Databricks after that to make it even faster than Spark, which is open source. But Microsoft is using the open source version, which is what makes Synapse differ from Databricks, for those of you who've ever heard that other word bandied about. So what can you do with Spark? Well, Spark contains a number of different components. I'm going to show you some Spark code, which is Python, but I'm going to show you the SQL part of it. And the SQL part of it is pretty easy to understand. And now you can, and the reason that's important is because I want to design a solution that my clients don't, have a lot of difficulty to maintain, because I'd rather have them maintain it. It's a good marketing plan. And plus I hate maintaining stuff. So I want to develop something that you could hand off to people and have them understand and have all the power in Power BI, because of course that's what it's really good at. And if you don't have terabytes worth of the data, this is a great solution for that kind of scenario. So give you a little background as to when I'm thinking this would be a really good tool. I also will say, though, that I have another client that I recently rolled off of, and they have, they're a defense contractor, so money's not an object. And they're also using the same scenario, but they're using, naturally, a more expensive backend. They're using the data warehouse to connect to Power BI, which is also something that you can do within Azure Synapse. So if you want to spend, lots of money, of course you can, but it's not necessary. So what do you get with Synapse anyway? Well, you can get a data warehouse, like I just mentioned. You don't have to use it. To be honest, I rarely use it because it costs money every minute that it runs. The minimum is $1.80 for every minute that runs. So make sure if you do turn one on, you'll remember to turn it off. And then they have what's called the serverless pool. And the serverless pool is what I just talked about earlier, where you have the ability to make your flat file, your SharePoint in the sky, as it were, into a database. And that's called a serverless pool. And it queries that flat file data using regular T-SQL, not weirdo SQL, T-SQL. Synapse also contains integration. Integration is that fancy Azure Data Factory stuff. They still aren't as good as them, but they do a lot of interesting things when it comes to triggering and various other components that M does not have. So it is considered a more enterprise kind of solution. If you've got really complex, weird stuff, it's also really good at parsing HTML, which is a nightmare if you've ever done a whole lot of that in M. And it also contains Spark notebooks, and Spark allows you to write Python and SQL to do what you need to do to your data to get it in a format that it's good for Power BI. And all of this is integrated with GitHub so that you have source control. So a source bot with me in Power BI. So what did you get for integration applications? Well, naturally, Power BI is integrated because, of course, they want to integrate Power BI. I don't know how many of you are like big time watching what's going on in Microsoft, but if you'll notice, like in the past year or so, a bunch of people who used to work for Power BI have moved over to Synapse because they want it to be as successful as Power BI has been. The latest being Chris Finland, the Power BI report bearer. He's now working for Synapse. And I saw that Will is mentioned that he's no longer working on the Power BI group, and I'm betting. And Kim Manis is now heading the Synapse group, and she, of course, came from Power BI. If you know her, she's works for Microsoft, has worked on Power BI, I think pretty much since its inception, and she now heads up the Synapse team. So they're stealing a lot of good people from Power BI because they want Synapse to be really successful, which also means they really know how to integrate it well.
Right. Yeah. And Will's comment when somebody directly said, my bet is Synapse, he says, well, not really. So
oh, really? He said that?
Yeah, I followed that whole thread on Twitter the other day. So he kind of alluded that it was maybe somewhat connected. I don't know if there's something in the middle that they're gonna, who knows? I don't think he's gonna go far, but he didn't say it was directly on the Synapse. So
because I didn't see that. I just told him I hope he got more shirts.
yeah, that was the general theme of that, but I can't remember who said that. And it was the comment that stuck out to me was it was like a not really.
Well, because I know that Patrick is working a lot. Patrick LeBlanc is, half the guy in the cube. He's working a lot with the Synapse team as well.
Yeah. Yep. Which is why they started putting out a Data Tuesday. And so they're pulling a lot of the Synapse people in. So if you watch a lot of the guy in the cube stuff, that's another good resource to keep learning after she tells you everything that you need to know to get started.
Yes, I have. They're on my list of Power BI links that I give to people when I teach the PL 300 class. But of course, Power BI integration is important because Power BI is a big part of the solution. Because frankly, if you have data and you can't see it, who cares? So it's integrated a couple of different ways, and we'll look at all of those. And they also integrated Azure ML. Again, that's also integrated into Power BI. You may not notice this, but if you go to Power Query, Azure ML is listed as an integrated application. Of course, you do have to have a premium instance to be able to make that work, but it's also integrated into Synapse. You can also write your own machine learning within Synapse as well, and that's another bunch of talks that I tend to give, which we're not going to be talking about here. It also integrates with Cosmos DB. Cosmos DB is a globally multi-redundant database that uses JSON, and it directly integrates with Synapse. Azure DevOps, of course, is integrated as well, so you can connect to either GitHub or DevOps, whichever one you feel like doing. Why not? Microsoft owns both of them now. And lastly, Azure SQL DB, which is now in preview finally, and you can directly connect to that as an integrated application within Synapse. So what Power BI with Synapse is designed to do, many different things, but one of the things that they added it for is the ability to integrate your data exploration and use Power BI instead of having to do a whole bunch of queries. So you can kind of thump around, do some trial and error with some charts and things and look at your data that way. And you could also connect to your logical databases. So not only can you connect to Power BI within Azure Synapse, should you wish to do so, you can just open up desktop and connect to the underlying data source, the data lake within that Synapse uses, and check it out and do analysis on it too once it's been set up within Azure Synapse. You can use Power BI for data warehouse reporting. Like I said, the large defense contractor that I previously worked for, we've done all of our reporting connecting Power BI to the data warehousing component of Azure Synapse and use that in our Power BI reporting. And and you can do a direct connection to the data lake with Power BI, which may or may not have anything to do with Synapse, but you can do that as well. So we're going to be talking about how to first integrate it inside of Azure Synapse. So if you have Azure Synapse, and I will walk you through it for those of you who've never played around with it, where you can connect to Power BI inside of the Synapse environment using a linked service. And so you point it to your instance, and then that's incorporated inside of Synapse. You can connect to multiple workspaces. So whatever you have in the workspace is available inside of Synapse, and you can use it to examine data inside of data lakes. The only trick here is it has to be inside the same Azure tenant. So you can't have a Power BI that's in one tenant and have your Azure Synapse in another tenant. And also, when you are playing around with Power BI and Azure Synapse, you'll want to make sure that your data, the data lake that you are connecting to, is in the same physical location of Power BI. So when I first created my Power BI, oh, and you can't move this, by the way. This is important to me because I created my Power BI tenants when I was bored and working in Iowa, and didn't have anything to do, so I created my Power BI instance. That means that although I don't live in the central part of the United States, my Power BI tenant is. So when I do things in Power BI, I always make sure that I'm in central US. And when I'm doing anything else, I tend to do it in West US. But you want to make sure that you are doing anything Power BI in the same place that your Azure Synapse is. So just create it in the same place. And if you don't know how to look at that, I will show you how to find out where your Power BI tenant is, so you know where your Synapse needs to be as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Since I just mentioned that part of it, let me show you that part of Power BI. So if you go to Power BI here, and you want to know where on earth is your tenant located, you will see where your data is stored. And like I said, I was in Iowa at the time, so that's where my tenant is listed. By the way, I was working at a Fortune 500 company not too long ago, and they had something similar happen with a consultant who created their Power BI tenant, and they wanted to move it. And like I said, big Fortune 500 company, and Power BI said, no, you can't move it. So they moved all of their Azure stuff to match where their Power BI tenant was. So you cannot move it once you have changed. So it's important to know, hey, I'm in Iowa, and that's where my data should be as well. So let's talk about Azure Synapse. So Azure Synapse, if you want to create one, I won't bore you with doing it, but suffice it to say, it's really pretty easy. You can just type Azure. You have to have, again, this will cost you some Azure bucks, but not to create an Azure Synapse instance. First you have to, come on. There we go. To create it's not going to cost you anything. Using it will cost you, but creating it won't. And you pretty much go through the little log in here, and it'll pretty much do this for you. The one thing to remember is that when you're creating an Azure Synapse workspace, it's based on, if you remember that slide that I showed you, it's based on your Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. Gen 2 is because that's when they added the file folders. The file folders are awesome. I don't know if you know why they still have the Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 1, probably because it has some Jagundo client that has all other stuff in there that's not moving. But you'll want to create a Gen 2 because that gives you hierarchical, which is basically fancy Azure speak for you to have folders so you can find stuff in. So it's part of your Azure Synapse application, so that you're going to go ahead and need to create one or use one that you have. So naturally, I call this the cooking school version of demos because I did that already. And I created this. Now I'll go back to I created this. So let's take a look at what I got. And what?
Ginger, if you could connect that, does that mean you could have multiple workspaces connected to the same Gen 2 storage? And would
Yes.
that be advisable?
You might need to.
Yeah, I could see that you might need to for other reasons too.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you have one that's primary, and maybe you don't make your primaries the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you might need to have multiple ones connected.
Okay.
So I definitely think that would be something you might want to do. But good question.
Anybody else that has questions, feel free to put it in the chat. And if I find a good spot to interrupt her like I have been, unless you'd rather us wait till the end, which way
No,
I should ask.
I think that it's great that you're doing it in context, because why wait? So yeah, feel free to interrupt me. So a good thing. So this is what you get. You're like, oh, that's not very interesting. So what you get now, this I had to add. I added this dedicated pool. Dedicated pool is the warehouse. This is the one that cost me $1.80 to run a minute. It's not running right now. And I also have this thing called a Spark pool. And a Spark pool is what I use to run to run Spark code. It takes about 4 minutes to start up, by the way. And so when I've got all this going on, you're like, okay, that's great. So what do I get? Well, when you click on Synapse Studio, it takes you to this environment. And this is where you do all of your fancy Power BI stuff. So it's got some good information down here on the community and understanding how to use it. And the Knowledge Center's got a lot of places where you can go that to start learning, and they've got some pretty good free tutorials that you can do. And then you've got these different areas here. So I've blown this up. So this is the home section. This is the data section. So under the linked section of the database, to your point about multiple data lakes, I've got 2 data lakes that I have connected here. Obviously, I only have one that says primary on it because there's only one primary, but I can connect to any other data lakes that I want to in Synapse. It's not a big deal. So let's say, though, that I want to connect to Power BI. How on earth would I do that? Well, with Power BI, what you do is you connect to, go back to my list view, you connect to workspaces. So I'm going to connect to some of the existing. Can you connect to multiple data lakes? Absolutely. So here I'm connected to multiple ones. So got multiple data lakes that I am connected to. You only can have one that's primary, but you can connect to anything, any other data lake that you want. So not a problem. You can have multiple ones and be connected to both of them. So good question. So here in Power BI, I'm going to connect to this sandbox because I haven't connected to it yet, basically. So this is going to be just a sandbox research area that I've got for information that I have for Power BI. You can see these are my data sets. And I got a bunch of some reports. I got some dashboards, trip information, all this sorts of good stuff. So I'm going to, let's just actually take a look at, this is just this is for the taxi data set that I analyzed. So this is actually, I think, take a look at this data set. Oh, this was actually taken from a data lake as well. So this is data lake information. This is a public data lake that Microsoft puts all of this taxi information on. So I can look at this within Power BI. So let me show you how to do that. So here within Power BI, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Manage. And these are my data connections. Now, remember I told you that you can connect to multiple data lakes? This is where you do it. So anything that I want to connect to that's addition to, like this is the U.S. employment hours earnings by state. This is a publicly available blob storage that I connected to because I wanted to analyze that data. So I can connect to as many Azure data lakes as I want to. I can also now connect to Sql Server if I wanted to. This is a preview feature though. It's not been released quite yet. So I've got, you'll notice here, I've got 2 workspaces already. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. And so I'm just going to say that I want to connect to a linked service. So Power BI is going to be linked here. So I'm just going to connect to Power BI. and it's going to say, what do you want to call it? Well, I want to call it sandbox because that's where it is. I don't have to call it this. I can call it whatever I feel like it. This is the name of my tenant. And so I can just do this drop-down box because heaven forbid I should type something because I'll do it wrong. And I can look for my Power BI Sandbox workspace. And if I wanted to edit this, I could, but this all looks fine to me. For annotations, I could add some annotations to this. And under advanced, I could do if any dynamic conditions. I don't want to do any of that. So I'm just going to say commit. So now it's creating this connection, and I have now my sandbox link service here. So what does that mean? So if we go into data, and oh, come on. Excuse me. If we go into develop, I lied. If we go into develop, we see that I now have an area here that says Power BI. So this is a development area. So I've connected to Power BI that way. And here I've got my Power BI sandbox that I just created. So these are all of the data sets, remember, that I looked at in here earlier. So all of my data sets that I played around with in Power BI sandbox, they're all here. And they all live here. And I can take a look at the reports that I created. So here inside of Synapse, I can take a look at reports, and I can also create new ones. So if I wanted to, take a look at the county and then trips and do this by, tip amount. I can create reports in here. And of course, if I created and go ahead and save this, and when I do, if we go back here, because I do this in the context of that I'm in my workspace. So you'll notice now that I have 2 pages. So this is the one that I just created. So I can work with Power BI within Synapse. Now, why might I want to do this? Well, if I want to analyze my data to make sure that I have correctly been manipulating it within Azure Synapse, then this is very helpful. So a couple of things that you can do here within Azure Synapse is, here I've done some analysis, and this is where that data, the taxi data that I just showed you, I'm writing code here to gather that data up from a cloud data source and then select it and then write it as a table and then use that in my Power BI. So this is some Spark code that I wrote, and we'll take a look at more code here in a little bit. But so within this environment, I can take a look at Power BI and I can start writing in Integrate. I'll show you a different one, but in Integrate, I don't have anything in here. In Integrate, you can write your more involved data manipulation that you might want to do to your data that you're using in Power BI. But this is just kind of a starter of what kinds of things you can do within Synapse and Power BI. And that first one, of course, would be just to straight up integrate it so you can actually write reports should you wish to do so using your data in Power BI. Okay. So let's talk about data management. I know you may think, hey, I just do all this in Power Query. You're making things hard. Yeah, I know. But when you have a lot of data, you might want to do this in a slightly different way. If your company has over 1 terabyte worth of data, then you might want to be looking at using a data warehouse. If you don't have over 1 terabyte of data, don't be like a company that I know that has more money than sense. And they're like, oh no, we're going to use everything. It's like, that's stupid. If you have less than 1 terabyte of data, just use this Azure SQL DB. Save yourself some money, and it'll work just fine. And you can use that to your data warehouse. You don't have to use the data warehousing components in Azure Synapse. Of course, if you do have over a terabyte of data, hey, it's a great tool. It can do lots of really cool things with organizing your data so it'll perform well if it's very large. If you've got flat files and you want to combine all this stuff, maybe that's something else that you want to consider. Well, how am I going to do this? Yes, I can load my flat files up into Power BI as well. And I can organize them there. But what if I also want to query those tables in a database as well? That is because if you do it all in Power Query, then you're kind of within the Power Query environment when you're doing queries. And then there's this like wacky thing that's like sounds like butter, Parquet format. And Parquet format is a file format, which you might have guessed by the dumb name, that is part of the Hadoop collective, because everything in Hadoop has a dumb name, that is used to store data. Now, Parquet, the reason that people store things in a Parquet format is because it's actually written similar to how the Vertipack engine works in Power BI. So it has a column store index, which means that like Power BI, it compresses things. So if you store data in Parquet format, it's compressed and takes up less storage space in the data lake. And while data lakes are not terribly expensive, you can decrease your storage space requirements by like 38%. So that's why people tend to store stuff in Parquet format. Little problem with Parquet though, you can't read it. So Parquet files, if you want to load those into Power BI, like I said, it's from an open source Apache Hadoop project. It was designed really to work very well with Spark because it's compressed. It knows how to load them into memory very efficiently and also allows you to take them out very efficiently. So it's something that a lot of people format with Park, and in Synapse, they format their files as Parquet. Once the files are stored in a Parquet format, you may hear people talking about saving it in a Delta format, which is just another layer of a Parquet format. A Delta-like format is more like a database that you put on top of your flat files, but the flat files have to be in a Parquet format to make that work. And Parquet files can be really easily read into Power BI. So let me show you how you would do that. Because this is something that you may come across. You may come across a company and they say, well, you know, we're going to be formatting our stuff in Parquet. How am I going to deal with that in Power BI? So like I said, I'm going to show you the cooking school version. And in that version, whoops, that's not that one. That is this one. So here is the cooking school version. And you can see here that I have a table. And my table has a whole bunch of IDs and a source, and there's over, if we look here, over 90,000 rows of data. Well, all of this data is actually Power BI. So let's take a look, excuse me, is in Parquet. So let's take a look at how all of that looks and works when we do this. So if we look at this, we can see here that here I have a Power BI, a Parquet file. Now, Parquet tends to bust the information up. And sometimes you have control over that and sometimes you don't. I won't bore you into all things Parquet, but this Parquet format, you'll notice that it comprises of 3 files, really. This one says success. Well, that's useful, but it doesn't have any data that you could possibly use. And then you've got these 2 blocks of data. So because I'm in Azure, I can kind of take a look at this. So I can, let me look at this in browser. Let's see, I know I can. This won't be that useful, but I wanted to actually show this to you. Oh, come on. Maybe get to a slightly different way. By the way, back this up a little bit. this is what an organized data lake would look like, where you bring in the data into your raw area, and then you might have some reference data, and then you would change it into a structured area, a staging area, an archive for when you're done with it, and then having something that is curated, which is where my data is here. And I guess I can't remember how to look at this. Well, trust me when I say that you can't read this, because I can't remember how to do that. So we're going to take a look at how to connect to this in Power BI, even though it's kind of a mess. And it's going to actually look like this when we're done. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go to Get Data, and I am going to select that I want to connect to Parquet. Now, here's a trick. I know that in Power BI, if you go to the admin function, it says that you need to connect to your Azure Data Lake in the Power BI service. Honestly, you can get away without doing that. So if you think, well, I can't possibly connect to that data in the data lake because the Power BI admin hasn't configured it to do that, that's not really true. So you can get away with it without having to be an admin and configure it. And you can actually load this to the service too. If you have rights, you can do that. Can't refresh it, but you can load it and you can work with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to this Parquet data. And so it says, well, what's the URL? What's the URL for this Parquet data? Well, the URL for the data is, go back to this data here. And we notice here that I am in this thing called root curated LAH, and the file folder is actually called familymember.parquet, and these files are within it. So to get the name of that, if I go here to my Power BI, because this is primary, this is a cheat, but you can do this for anything. The primary account, it'll tell you what it is, but it's basically the name of the instance, DFS core and at windows.net. And then you have to start adding the other elements in with it. So mine is root, and then curated. And then I have to look because I'll get it wrong. Okay, it's LATH. And then say okay. And it says, how do you want to connect? I want to do this account. I have to sign in again. Although I am signed in. And so this is applying it to the top level, but it's going to allow me to connect to the other levels.
So while we're waiting, Jeremy did put a question in there as well about, so Parquet is cheaper when we are being charged for every row of data.
So the thing about data storage is just that. So with data storage, you're charged for every gig of data. So it's not like row by row by row. It's how much it is per the different amount that you have stored. So data storage is really cheap. It's a couple of like $1 a month for like half a terabyte. So it's not terribly expensive. I know some people that have actually stopped sending their data to Iron Mountain, and instead they send it to they copy it to blob storage because it's cheaper to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, like you said, is you could store anything under blob storage. It's just going to cost you whatever that rate is per month or whatever. But the one advantage is Parquet, I believe, compresses better than just like a CSV, right?
Yeah.
So if you are worried about that part of it, then Parquet will help you out with that part. But I don't know that that's the main reason people go to Parquet. Because like we're saying, storage inside Azure Blob or the Gen 2, the data lake is so cheap, especially when you compare it to other stuff. I wonder if you got a window behind the window somewhere.
I was thinking that because this is taking. Yes, I do. Where is that window? I have the you need to log in window, which I'm trying to figure out. Where is hidden?
I had that hide the other day and I had to kill desktop. I couldn't find it.
I was just funny because I can. Well, I just minimized a whole bunch of stuff, so maybe I can see it. Yep.
There you go.
Connect. Yep. Exactly what it was doing. I have to remember what that password is. It's a ridiculous password.
Password 123.
Yep. Connect. Well, in case the demo guys didn't like me, I do have it this way. So we'll take a look at this in transform data. So if we look at it in transform data, we'll notice that what it saw is this is my source, right? So I've got these two binary files. So it's going to ask me, how do you want to do that? And I said to get all of them from this same thing that I tried to enter. So get the whole path. So it says, okay, so you want everything in the path, right? Yes. So once you do that, then it just imports it. So it will take all of your data and put it together, even though, as you can see here, I have two files. I have three files, actually. This has got nothing in it. And the other two have data. So it will combine nothing with the two data files, and then which is grabbing everything, which is what this folder is saying that it does, and importing my data. So I then have the ability to take a look at my data, even though I can't read this. Now, naturally, you can connect to CSV files in a data lake, but I also wanted you to show that, hey, if this used to not work right, like many things in Power BI, it has improved over time. So if it is something that you were trying to do before and you're like, yeah, it doesn't work, try it again, because it does work very good now. You do just have to make sure that you have your login credentials are correct. And I don't know what I did wrong with mine, but it's relatively straightforward to do, and it will combine the files together for you. So you don't really have to do anything because they are, randomized things that it just does. So with that.
Great. Can I have one more part on the Jeremy's question, right? Since Parquet does compress better, once you start using it in Synapse later, are you going to have less compute cost because the compressed file helps you out?
Yes, but not only that, the other issue that you have with Parquet is there's things that you can't do in anything else besides Parquet from a Spark perspective. So if I wanted this to change this into Delta Lake format, it has to be in Parquet. If I want it to be the best performing database, it needs to be in Parquet. So it does more for me than just compression. And we'll take a look at those other elements that I talked about here next when we're talking about making virtual databases on top of our data.
That's all I was trying to do, is lead you into the next part.
There you go. So in addition to, we looked briefly at the different kinds of pools, and that's how Synapse actually talks about its different types of compute engines. So let's say that you're running Spark and you're like, dang, this is slow. I have an infinite amount of money. I'm just going to change the computer. No problem. You can just create yourself a bigger Spark pool, which is basically the functional equivalent of buying yourself a new server. and then you can run whatever size you want, can afford, and it'll run much faster. And the same is true with dedicated pools. Now, serverless pools, no. Serverless pools, you get what you get. They do not get any bigger. And serverless pools are what's used for creating virtual databases. So you cannot make those go any faster, unfortunately. So what you can do with the serverless pool, though, is make yourself a virtual database, which we're going to take a look at. So it's designed to work with Azure Data Lake Gen 2. I don't have to have this be my primary data lake at all. It can definitely use any one that I want to combine. What it's using is using this hierarchical storage, and that I showed you what a well-organized one looks like, so that you can directly organize your data well. And you can bring all sorts of other data that you happen to have and throw it in there, and then use it in your pool. So ideally, of course, if you're talking about Power BI consumption, you want to create yourself a good data model and have that data model be within your data lake. So all you have to do when you get to Power BI is just connect to it and go. So you can load these as a relational tables into a faux data warehouse or a data mart, or straight up into Power BI. So let's take a look at that. So how do if I want to create a virtual database, what's that going to do for me? Well, you don't have to have a virtual database for Power BI, but it does make things easier to connect if you choose to do that. And then you can have a database and not pay for it. It's slower, but you may find that it meets your needs. And if you find out that it is too slow for any database needs that you have within your organization, you can always buy yourself a database and move the data to it. Not a problem. It is comparable to an Azure DB. Of course, Azure DB has many different sizes. So, and you can connect to it using standard SQL Server Management Studio. So I wanted to kind of walk through some code for this. So let me pull up my data elements here. So here within my develop section, what I can do is I can create a logical data warehouse. And so here I've created one called AWDW, and I've said that this is my data source. So what does this mean? So this is where it's connecting to. Well, where the heck is that? So what this is this is my data lake called Synapse Power BI. So again, I've got more than one data lake here. So here in this data lake, I've got a blob storage container, and I could put it in Synapse. No, this is where my workspaces are. And I've got some data that I have here that I want to put into my database, and so I can do that within Power BI. Excuse me, within Power BI, within Azure Synapse. So what I can do is just basically say anything within Synapse Power BI, I want to put that. So if I've got this here, I did it for Power BI, and here I'm creating a product using a different data lake. So I've created an external data source, and I've also got another data source that I'm using. So for this particular one, this data is here. So I'm going to put this data into my database, and this is CSV data, which I created just because to make things easier for me when I was doing a demo, basically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load this data into a table, and this is my table, and I've created views off of it. And I can create tables off of it. So once I've run this code, what do I get? Well, if we look here in my data, I've got this database that shows up, and it's not showing up. There's a bug that's showing up. Here we go. And here's my database. And so here's the views that I created. So if I want to take a look at them, I can take a look at them here within Azure Synapse, writing regular straight up SQL. But if I think, oh, I don't want to deal with that, I just want to deal with SQL. Now, this is running, it's a little bit slower, I might add, because this is just a calendar. But I do get all of my data. Now, if I also want to use SQL Server Management Studio, which is what I've loaded up here, we can see this is that same database. And so I've created a virtual database and I can just use SQL Server as, oh, and I've got a credential error here, but I swear I must not have sacrificed enough to the demo gods today. Here is also, this is also a Synapse database, so hopefully I have connected correctly into one of them. It's executing my query. So this one I do have a decent thing into. So here I'm connected to a different SQL database that I'm able to do queries on. Now, how does that work with Power BI? Let's actually take a look at that. So here, if I am connected to Power BI and I want to connect to my faux database, right? How do I do that? Well, I can just do get data, and I can go to SQL Server. And within SQL Server, I can connect to the database that I created, and I can connect to it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So this is my Synapse. It's on my on-demand. And again, I'm too lazy to connect to any particular database. And here, you can see that I can connect to these data elements. So anything that I've got in my data lake, if somebody has created this virtual database thing for me within Synapse, I can then load that up into Power BI. And then I don't have to care what format it's in because it's in a virtual database. So I can just go ahead and load all of my data up, start using it in Power BI as if I was any other data source. And I said SQL Server, but it's really not a SQL Server, and it's giving me that same error. I have some permission things that I do need to resolve, but this is the same thing that I can connect to using Power BI and a virtual database within Azure Synapse once I figure out why I have security issue problems. But it's pretty straightforward thing to do that you can connect to databases that people have created within Azure Synapse into Power BI. So it doesn't really matter to you that it's in a flat file format. Of course, once you've got it loaded, it refreshes like anything else would. And since it's cloud-based, you don't need a gateway. Always good to know. All right, so we took a look at virtual databases in Synapse. So today, other than the demo that didn't work, and I'm sorry about got issues with my security, but we looked at some different components of Azure Synapse, looked at some different things you can do. We looked at how you can integrate Power BI with it. We looked at how you can use it to access Parquet data, what Parquet data looks like from a file perspective. And then we took a look at connecting to Power BI with using virtual databases as well. And with that, I wanted to also let you know that one of the conferences that you didn't mention is in December 6th, the first week, is the Azure Data Conference. Microsoft puts this one on in Las Vegas. If you use promo code GRANT, I think you get $100 off. And I am doing Power BI DAX in a day. So one full day of DAX if you want to do that.
And it's Vegas, baby.
It is. And Trevor's going to be there.
All right. So we did have a question that just came in.
Sure.
Would you give us a difference between Synapse and Databricks and when to use Synapse?
So basically you use what you get stuck with using, but Databricks is, so the guys, like a bunch, back up. Spark was created by a bunch of graduate students who went to Berkeley. And about 75% of that group decided that this open source stuff was nice, but they wanted to make some money. And like every single coding thing that I've ever been involved with, once you're done, you're like, I could have made that so much better. Now knowing what I know, let's redo it. And so they decided that they were going to do just that. They're going to redo, Spark into a commercial environment, not open source. It was going to be better, and they were going to get paid for it. So they did, and they created Databricks. And Databricks was first created on AWS, and then it was available on Microsoft in 2018, I believe. And then it is now available on Google as well. So Databricks is a third-party application. It also does Spark. It doesn't, you can use it to do a lot of the different things that you can do with Synapse. However, what it really does, it does Spark on top of data. So if you want to write a lot of Spark code, it's great for that. You can create you can create virtual databases within it as well on different kinds of data, because it is a different company. So they have a lot more things that they'll allow you to create virtual databases with instead of just Azure Data Lake. If you, like I said, if you're using AWS, you could use it as well. Price point wise, it's comparable. But I will say that, you know, they did figure out how to make Spark go faster. So when you write straight Spark code on large amounts of data, it will process more quickly on Databricks than it will on Synapse. So it is not open source, which means that most of the stuff will work. It's pretty open source compliant, but you can't lift and shift your code. It's not exactly the same.
And look for Microsoft, right? Kind of like what Ginger talked about early on, is a lot of the Power BI people moved over to Synapse, right? Because they're looking to really grow Synapse. So, you know, what I think we'll be seeing is they're going to move faster and try, right? I mean, Microsoft stands up Azure Databricks as well, right? So they you know, you can have it within your environment. So obviously they have to do something better in the Synapse environment in order to make you want to come over to that. And some of the things that have come out recently, I think that was announced over in Build. Some of the things that are still in preview, like using the change data capture to bring in SQL data. I think what has been over, you mentioned Cosmos DB, where it could automatically bring things in from that as well, and keeping your change logs. I think you're going to see those type of things continue to grow.
Well, the other thing too is that the virtual databases that exist within Databricks are not easy to connect to with Power BI, and because of how they work, they will cost you more money because of the cluster. They're using the Spark clusters, so they're not as cheap because they're using different kinds of compute. The only compute you have with Databricks is you've got your Spark pools, and with Synapse you've got your serverless pool, which is a lot cheaper if you're doing a lot of querying.
That's right.
And, yeah, so that's another difference that it has too. So
and I think I have heard of people, right, that if they just wanted to use Databricks for whatever reason, they would. But you could still connect your Synapse to that same data lake that Databricks is using, and if it's putting out the same compliant files, then use the serverless there. You could blend the two. You might want to stick on one platform, kind of like what you were saying is some people like to just take up everything. But you know,
for machine learning capabilities, both of them in the machine learning capabilities, they're both using Spark ML. They both use the MLlib library. Synapse can incorporate Azure ML better than you can within Databricks, as you might guess. And what that gets you is the organization of your machine learning components in one environment. You can make that work in Databricks, but it's a little bit more convoluted to do so. If you wanted to incorporate it, it's not plug and play. But if you're talking about ML, you're basically talking about the Spark MLlib, and that's pretty much the same. Although, like I said, if you're just talking straight Spark, Databricks will be faster.
Great. Any other questions that anybody wants to put in the chat, or come off mute real quick and ask? As we're waiting, I did want to point out to people that I have my hat on. That's the right transform data as far upstream as possible and downstream as necessary, right? So Synapse, if you think about it, where we say don't transform your data over in like DAX or whatever, take it to Power Query. Well, now from Power Query, as Ginger mentioned earlier, go up to Synapse when it's even bigger or you want more flexibility, right? Go as far upstream as possible. So had to get my hat notice.
Yeah, well, where'd you get that?
I had them made. I'll bring in some to Chicago. I'll send you one if you want. I'll just DM me. I have a few more. So
you have hats.
I always wear a hat, so that's like
Your hat guy.
Yeah, in Jessica's little Saturday morning learning group that we put together, that's what they call me, as hat guy. So
that's pretty funny.
Hey, this is Kevin. Nice hat. This is Almond. Ginger, thank you so much for the. Yeah, I do for the presentation. And I, as I said at the outset, I really am green to all this stuff. I kind of missed, and I'm sorry if it's just me, but the thing about the first slide that had all of the diagram of the pieces of the system, and then there's the piece with GitHub and Azure DevOps. So what are the chunks that are being controlled through GitHub and Azure DevOps? And I think I even saw something popped up when you were working that said, well, you did a commit and it said it pushed it back to GitHub.
So pretty much anything. So like I have like this is a SQL script. If I want to save this to GitHub, I can save this SQL script to GitHub. In my develop area here, I've got, a bunch of notebooks, and these are all, saved in GitHub as well. So if I had anything in integrate, I don't here, it would all be saved into GitHub as well.
Okay.
Not so much my data, not that, but any code that I might write.
Gotcha.
So here you can see that SQL script statement is there. If I, create anything else, this is stored in GitHub, for example. Okay.
Makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And that's where you would start getting into making things parameterized. That sound good? Right. So that if you think about I'm in like a dev and a production environment, right, to be able to promote it forward and things like that.
Yes.
Once you have it there, you could do all of those nice things as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the data wouldn't be in the GitHub, right? But it would be all the code to kind of create everything, stand up everything, just change out your parameters, and now you can move it and deploy it into your next environment type of thing.
Yep, absolutely.
And I'm assuming it could use Azure DevOps as well as GitHub.
Yeah, either one. It just depends on which one you feel like connecting to. Doesn't matter.
Right. Good question, Amin. Anybody else? Normally what we also do here is after the presentation, we move to kind of like an open mic type of thing. So if there's no more questions, or I'll wait a minute to see if there are, but if not, we'll move on. Siri, I know you're not shy. You could come off and tell her it was a great session.
I wish I have some questions, but this is first question, so thank you.
Great. Well, let me go ahead and stop the recording. If I could figure out how. In that same little area.